Now, the next speaker is Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan. Deputy O'Sullivan, you're sharing time with Deputy Richard Boyd Barrett, Deputy Shane Ross, Deputy Claire Daly, Deputy Mick Wallace and Deputy Seamus Healy. Is that correct? 5 minutes each?
5 minutes each, yes. Thank you, Cormagat. Neadar me gain these fork no ahantas an overshaw and nocht gan and gano kilki prevoijak agus an ubbery and Dáil Joe Higgins an overshaw. I think it's very important that we acknowledge, we discuss and we commemorate those defining moments in our history, like the strike and lockout. And incidentally, on the 31st of August is going to be a community organised reenactment of Larkin's speech on O'Connell Street and the baton charge by the police. But I'm struck by a number of ironies, and the first one is, and I'm glad you're here, Minister, that we're coming into a decade of commemoration and commemorating these defining moments in our history. And if the Minister for Education and the Department get their way, history will be completely and utterly downgraded with these plans for the reform of the junior cert, and history will end up being a blip on the curriculum. President Michael D. Higgins said last night that without good history teaching, there is no shared idea of a public past, and he was stressing the importance of learning from history. Well, my point is, how can we learn from history if we don't know what happened in history? And we will end up with generations of people who have never heard of Larkin and Connolly and will have no understanding of those defining moments. I'm also struck by the irony of 1913 and the casual labour, and I want to acknowledge the work of the Dublin Dock Workers Preservation Society. They've amassed an amazing amount of photographs and memorabilia of that time. And what you see and what we know is of the casual labour and people lining up on the docks, on the quays for 1, maybe 2, 3 days' work, all at the whim of a foreman. And we think about today, 100 years later, and we have a return to that ethos of contract work with very little security for the workers. There's also the irony in the appalling conditions in the tenements, with the overcrowding and the lack of sanitation and the serious health issues. And a few weeks ago, the intensified inspection scheme from Dublin City Council found that 90% of private rented accommodation in the inner city in certain parts were unfit for human habitation. So the slum landlords of the 1900s have been replaced by the slum landlords of the 21st century. This event did begin with a lockout by employers of workers, with employers trying to deny workers their right to a fair wage and decent working conditions. Now, we know that a lot of work has been done down through that 100 years on better working conditions, pay, pensions, etc., through the unions, through the Labour Court, Labour Relations, the Ombudsman, the Employment Appeals Tribunals. But we still have employers who refuse to recognise or allow or work with unions. And if we broaden the spectrum, and I look at those international trade agreements with the resource-rich developing countries of the Global South, and we see a lack of compulsory and an integral part for labour rights that will be compulsory in those agreements. So we see workers in appalling conditions. We know what happened in Bangladesh recently in the mines in South Africa. They have little or no protection, while the multinationals are making obscene profits. The Dublin and the Ireland of 1913, we know, was one of gross social and economic divisions and disparities, with a very unequal distribution of wealth. And we have to look at our world today and see how much progress we have made. There's still a gross imbalance, not just in Ireland, but globally. Looking at William Martin Murphy, I suppose we could say perhaps he was our first multinational corporation when we think of what he controlled. You know, he controlled the media through all the papers he had, he controlled transport through the tramway company, he controlled retail, and he controlled hotels. And I was at the Centre for Cross-Border Studies in Liberty Hall last Friday, and Frances O'Grady, the General Secretary of the TUC, made an interesting comparison, and she thought he was a mixture of Michael O'Leary and Rupert Murdoch, but she made the comment that probably less ego but a bit more charm. I don't know. I think the union movement of 1913, it was intrinsically linked with the Irish struggle for independence, and the Irish Citizen Army were with the volunteers in the Easter Rising, and the Starry Plough flew alongside the tricolour at the GPO. And I make another plea to the Minister that for a proper renovation and restoration of the battlefield site from the GPO to Moore Street, where the Minister, with the local authority, with the relatives and others, could work together to bring this about. There's also the irony that Dublin was the recipient of foreign aid with a ship that came in from Britain from the trade unions there. And I think it worked out at several million worth of food that they sent over. And again, there's going to be a reenactment of that on the docks in Dublin next October. I want to acknowledge the women of 1913, like Helena Maloney and Dora Montefiore, and typical women. They were into direct action and a very practical solidarity. We know that the strike was initially a failure, and we can imagine the humiliation for the workers having to go back into work. But victory came eventually, and I think it came from them because of their solidarity, their unity and their belief in change and the way in which they stood up. And I think we know where Larkin and Connolly would be today. They would be with those who are suffering the cuts, those who are suffering the austerity disproportionately. They would be with the community groups, the youth groups and with the disabled.
Thanks, Deputy.